So Carlos Alcaraz, your 2025 Rome champion, and in my eyes, in doing so, really stamped this year that, this is the true, worthy Prince of Clay successor. Obviously, in capturing this year's Rome crown, he not only stamps himself as the heavy favorite heading to Roland Garros this year, but he also completes the complete trophy set of major clay titles. That too, a little bit under 2 weeks after his 22nd birthday. A fabulous achievement to top off a monstrous clay court season that I think, particularly in the second half of this match, finally got the signature apex level performance that it was worthy of. As really from 6-5 in the tiebreaker through the rest of the match, Alcaraz sort of went berserk and really sapped the energy out of this highly billed final, obviously, and quickly overwhelmed Jannik Sinner, who probably, this soon into the comeback was not ready for such a drastic ramp up in opposition. And you know what? The way Alcaraz played in that second set, I don't know if it matters. Fully fit, no matter who it is, that is a handful to deal with. And if you didn't watch the preview, I don't really have that much more to say than, if you want the cliff notes, I came to the understanding this clay court season, I think, that Alcaraz, whatever you want to call his best surface, which to this point, it is, up to those two natural surfaces, clay and grass. I think there's good arguments to be made on both sides. But what I have come to understand, I think, this clay court season is that definitively Alcaraz's floor is the highest on clay. It's not like the lows, look that much different. They can look just as ugly on this surface. The roller coaster nature still is there on clay. You would see that throughout his Roland Garros run last year, albeit not 100%. And, more so through a greater sample this year, where I would say that we didn't really see that top-end apex level really all clay court season, save a couple of them you could argue in Barcelona, but even then it felt like I think he had another gear to go to, and off of this final on Sunday he obviously did. And again, conversations around him I feel like do tend to reflect the crazy high standard he has set by being so good so early, that even when he's winning, it's like it doesn't look like it did in 2022 or 2023. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, even for this clay court season, most of it while he's been winning. But that's the operative term, right? He's winning. Make no mistake about it. His record since Roland Garros last year, which even including that, also largely not at his best. And on this surface, the gold standard obviously is his countryman, Rafa Nadal. And nobody will ever look that unbeatable because, not only was it the mind-boggling winning, but 90% of the time it wasn't even close while he was winning. And it's never going to look like that for Alcaraz. At least I wouldn't imagine so. But it's no mistake his record on this surface has been so sparkling, even through a patch of not playing his best since Roland Garros last year on this surface. Since he's become a top player, it has largely taken a special performance to beat him, regardless of what he's bringing to the table. His skill set is just one that caters so well to clay as, just his baseline standout attributes, which of course, there's so many, and almost all of them, bolster what a complete package he is on this surface, because he is the fastest player on tour. That's one of the things that jumps out the most to people for success on clay, is being a great mover. being a guy that, packs the punch physicality-wise, which at this point, I would probably say it's between him and Zverev as far as, the best conditioned athletes at the top of the sport. And I don't even think that's really to a push. I think Alcaraz still has, a noticeable edge there as tops in that department as well. And then you look at clay, what's equally important is point construction. The big forehands have thrived on clay over the years, and obviously Alcaraz can do so much with that shot. It was a hallmark, really off both wings in this final, and something that Carlos himself, hammered home about how pleased he was in this final, in really deploying the vast array of his variety on both wings. He was doing a great job spinning balls and getting them up high with good depth to, not allow Sinner to really take initiative. Same with the slice, and I kind of felt like this was something that this was a path that Alcaraz hadn't approached the Sinner matchup with since the Indian Wells match last year, where that was what turned it around, was him playing with more shape. And then, you look at what he has at his disposal with point finishing. He obviously hits that forehand as big as anybody when it connects. And then, of people I've seen, he's certainly right there in the conversation for the best touch finisher I have ever seen. You saw that on the set point, the way that he dealt with Sinner's, sort of dink pass that wasn't the easiest to deal with, and he hit a great drop volley off it. And, of course, that point, as well as the match point, the lunging volley to finish. And then, of course, the drop shot, which he has brought to such, prominence since he's burst onto the scene. There is no shortage of ways for him to finish these points off. And it seems to me that, every single one of his strengths are just amplified on the surface. And that makes it so, even when you do have the dips, he is still just absurdly difficult to deal with. It's harder to punish him when he does dip. And then again, even when he's not at his best, his physicality being so rock solid, it's no coincidence, again, that it seems so often that people are jaded against Alcaraz on this surface, something I've noticed. You can survive the first, 2 hours or so, first 2, maybe 3 sets, but we've seen people wear down. We've seen people's bodies even break down, deep into matches against Alcaraz on clay. And, all that goes out the window when, he just puts it all together and he activates like he did in that second set. I mean, when he plays like that, it's just, God only help you. And Alcaraz's funhouse was open for business in that second set. And that after, kind of being let off the hook at the back end of that second set. I picked Alcaraz in 3. I expected a tough match, as most people would, whenever these two play. But for it to be that way, Sinner most definitely had to win that first set. And the opportunity was certainly, wide open for him at that 5-6 game where he had the 15-40, the 2 set points. Maybe that's where, his time off showed, and he coughs up, 3 to 5 balls in this game from 15-40 that you just don't see from Jannik Sinner, regardless of surface conditions. In clutch moments, we've come to expect him to just batten down the hatches. And misreturns were a theme for both guys up until that point. But, he also got into some rallies over the course of this 5-6 game once he was up set points, and was way off with the backhand down the line, I think on the first set point. And then one of the deuces had, for him as close to a sitter, not, like a powder puff ball, but a pretty easy forehand that if he connects with it, he either hits a winner or sets him up in the ascendancy in the point. And that entire game from that point, just surprising misses from Jannik. And I had based my prediction off of, I don't think that Jannik could have been ready, for such a big ramp up in the opponent, the physicality. Carlos was always going to be able to have avenues of, testing maybe some of the points of vulnerability for Sinner so early in the comeback in ways that nobody else could. Certainly did that once he imposed himself. You saw a huge gap between the two of them in defense. Alcaraz, throughout this match, never lacked patience, never felt like he needed to press, and even came up with, some remarkable gets, showing off, the ridiculous retrieval skills. And, it felt like every time he got on top of the point, there really was no way back to neutral for Jannik. And yeah, that first game of the second set could have been a moment to maybe stem the tide, but Alcaraz never let his guard down. Once he got out of that first game, everything was flowing. And from that point, it was off to the races. Alcaraz really toyed with Sinner in a way that we have not seen with this Jannik Sinner 2.0 since really all the way back to the last time he was straight-setted, back in November of 2023 when Novak Djokovic threw it back in the final of Torino. And for the first time since, he was rendered kind of helpless. Whether it was the forehand, large and in charge, some of the drop shots were ridiculous from positions, both court positioning wise and, the timing within the rally, that it just shouldn't work, and he just feathered it over. And yeah, on that Sunday, Carlos had all the answers. He goes from, before this match, probably the solid favorite still, far and away the best clay court season, to now probably the consensus pick for Roland Garros right now. You look across the landscape right now, Carlos Alcaraz, in my time watching the sport, only Rafa and Novak have won multiple of the Clay Masters going to Roland Garros. I would guess, immediately preceding that, maybe Guga did it. I know Muster did it. Point is, it doesn't seem to happen, all that often in recent memory, of course, unless you are Nadal on clay, whose reputation precedes itself. And yeah, Carlos is certainly going to come in confidence-wise and, most importantly, physically better than he was a year ago. Of course, when he won the title, and as we know throughout his career, he has been a best-of-5 riser. The best-of-5 element only makes him all the more harder to defeat. And, everything I've outlined as far as his skill set catering to clay, and then particularly the physical measurables, that becomes all the more a factor in the best-of-5 format. And again, it's not like I expect him to, all the time play the way that he did in the second half of this final. But it's got to feel ominous that, he flashes it in the biggest match of his year. I, of course, in the preview was calling for it, and a few hours later, there it is, the Apex Carlos Alcaraz sighting. And you look across the rest of the landscape, Jannik Sinner, too, will almost surely arrive to Roland Garros physically better than he was a year ago. Obviously, it was documented then, I think it was the hip issues he picked up in Madrid, and then illness, had him bedridden leading up to the tournament. But with how consistent he is, and again, he's someone with a very high floor himself, especially against the rest of the field, I'm not going to be completely misled that them on clay is going to look like that. Sinner can do, he can play him better than he did in this final. Of course, on the surface, some of the things that are there for him on the other surfaces, particularly hard courts, are not slanted his way as heavily on the clay, and it's easier to get to, maybe the only thing that's still exploitable with Sinner, and that is, getting him into the trenches, into these lengthier, more physical matches. It's still yet to be seen, mainly because of how, clinical he's been over the last year and a half plus. And being clinical will still be available for him to most of the rest of the field, as we saw at Rome, and his level will probably continue to improve, go up from what it was in Rome. Again, it's a tough spot to be in when you're not playing for a while. If you're a special player like Jannik Sinner, the other mere mortals are still going to have a hard time being able to, get to those weaknesses or exploit anything that might not be at its best immediately. But when you go against a fellow special player, best believe if a component is not all the way back, they will be able to exploit that. And so, yeah, you can come away from this tournament for him. It's a great tournament. He at least got to measure himself against the man to beat right now. And I don't think the gap is as big as it looked in the second half of that match. Albeit, it still does feel like Alcaraz and the rest to me this year, heading to Roland Garros. Zverev, he has shown in the past, obviously, a level that can be formidable for anybody, Alcaraz included. But we all know, it's sort of, I need to see it to believe with Sasha in the best of 5 format. When it counts, Draper, he's actually fared quite well, I think, on clay for his first good bit of run, on this surface that he struggled with massively in the past. But obviously he's a new player this year, and so far so good, but he's probably also going to have to deal with the physical limitations. I think Novak Djokovic still is a bit of an X factor here, because if you ask me right now, what would be the only acceptable loss for Alcaraz, I feel like after that final, it still would be a well-playing Novak Djokovic. But as the days pass, and Novak will be 38 by the time this French Open starts, it becomes a bigger and bigger if we get a well-playing Novak Djokovic in Paris this year. But, I know for sure that guy has the mettle to hang with Alcaraz, suffer with what Alcaraz will put you through on a clay court. I feel like he should still have the legs, although I'm not sure, because it's been quite a while since Novak's, been pushed the distance, really been in one of these physical wars. The last time probably was the Olympics final, and then before that, those 2 matches at Roland Garros against Musetti and Cerundolo. But the wild thing is with him is, I think the thing you question most with him right now is the game. Does he have the game? Because it's been such a jarring sample size on clay this year. Very small, and that is because he's been so atrocious in the 2 matches he's played. But for him, I'll still say, majors are an entirely different story. Sure, he hasn't won one since the US Open in 2023, but he goes from in best of 3 since, 2024 being pretty pedestrian for his standards. Of course, excluding the Olympics, the last vintage sighting of him, which again was against a well-playing Alcaraz, which is where, this X Factor distinction to him for me still kind of finds itself, is the memory of that, and to a lesser extent, their match in Australia. He's looked pretty comfortable in all 3 of their clay court matches, and he's still been probably the 3rd, maybe 4th best player at worst in the slams after Sinner and Alcaraz. He plays Geneva this week. Let's see, what he can put on the board. But regardless, I still feel like I'd be surprised if Djokovic was upset, before week 1, particularly a quarterfinal. And once he's that deep into the tournament, he's going to work his way into being very tough to beat. But certainly a lot more uncertainty with him than I thought after the way he started the year and since Australia. And then the rest, I'm very confident in Carlos being able to take care of everybody else. So, all in all, it's looking great for the kid heading to the year's second major this year. That disappointing sunshine double start to the year for Alcaraz seems like a long time ago all of a sudden. And beyond that, for all of us as a tennis viewing audience, it is always a pleasure to watch Alcaraz in full flight, the way that he was in the second half of that final. Truly tennis near the gods. But that'll do it for this video. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and if you did, it would be much appreciated if you could drop a like on this video, help it perform a lot better in YouTube's algorithm, and also subscribe to the channel if you're not already. Thank you all again so much for watching. I appreciate you, and of course, I will see y'all in the next one.